Nobody had more influence on Anglophone military thought over the last 100 years than Basil Liddell Hart. He was born in 1895 in the reign of Victoria, came of age in the year before the Great War, and wrote doctrine from the year after. In 1925, when he was still 29 years of age, the rising chief of the Imperial General Staff, desperate for good press, encouraged the Daily Telegraph to hire him as military correspondent. From that year, he published journalistic reports every few days, magazine articles every few months, and about one book per year, for a total of at least 35 books. He claimed to have been published in 42 countries and 31 languages. He was yet more prolific as a letter writer. His own archive contains almost 1,000 correspondence. He garnered inside information which raised the value of his journalism, and thence the books based on his journalism. By the 1930s, he directly advised ministers and flag officers. Most of his policies, prescriptions, and predictions seemed discredited by the Second World War. However, during the 1950s, he popularized himself as prodigy, family man, intellectual, war hero, exposer of hard truths about the Great War, rigorous historian, author of British doctrine, strategist, fearless journalist, army insider and outside critic, political sage, opponent of appeasement, secret guru to Britain's government during the Second World War, misunderstood proponent of negotiated peace, maligned proponent of a low-cost war, inventor of blitzkrieg, America's adopted hero, Israel's inspiration, academic, writer, and mentor to a new generation of historians. In 1965, his memoirs cemented the narrative. In 1966, he was knighted by the Queen and photographed for the National Portrait Gallery. When he died in 1970, he left his legacy to a second wife, a son, and dozens of direct mentees and disciples who would memorialize, biograph, and defend him for decades. He opined on everything from politics to femininity. Even where we criticize him, we cannot ignore him. Previous memorialists and biographers relied on what Liddell Hart said or wrote late in life about what he had said or written early in life. They themselves were never satisfied with any single biographer, but their consensus survived John Mearsheimer's revisionism in 1988. They colluded in various counter-revisionist works and authorized biographies. More than a quarter century has passed since the last authorized biography, and 55 years have passed since the subject's death. Since then, new archives of correspondence have been opened. My biography is the first to cite these archives. It gives a fresh and objective insight into Liddell Hart's life, thought, and legacy. Major parts of his life have not been biographed before, such as his influence on academia. Other parts have been covered up, such as his sympathies for fascism. The final part of his life has been dominated by reinvention, to the neglect of embarrassments, such as appeasement and defeatism. While academics celebrate his liberalism, they cover up his sympathy for fascism. While mentees highlight his tolerance, they ignore his viciousness. While disciples celebrate his reforms, of the army in particular, they neglect sycophantic promotions. While he and they quote his urgings for mechanization, they skip over his vague and mistaken specifications of the machines themselves. While they champion his progress towards anti-aircraft defense, they minimize his regression to static defenses. And while his fabrication of blitzkrieg has been exposed, His confidence in hit-and-run raids by light tanks alone has not. While disciples champion his worthy searches for indirect approaches, they skip over his unstable agendas, analogies, and abstractions. While they highlight his concern for lower casualties, they neglect his expectations and prescriptions for a long, indecisive war. While his urgings for negotiated peace have been retold, his invention of peace feelers has not. This book reveals a more nuanced person and legacy than previously presented. Only honest admission of the nuances enables us to take his positive contributions without the negative. The chapters in my biography review Basil Liddell Hart in terms of his own self-images. From the start, he saw himself as a prodigy. The first chapter describes his unusual childhood, physiognomy, and psychology. Second, he saw himself as a family man, with a quick first wife, Jessie, a troubled son, Adrian, a long-term mistress, an eventual second wife, Kathleen, and 2 stepdaughters. Third, he presented himself as an intellectual. The third chapter compares his self-images and performances as a scholar, genius, scientist, truth-seeker, arguer, lecturer, correspondent, tolerator, theorist, logician, and operations researcher. Liddell Hart was a war hero who nonetheless exaggerated his heroism. As explained in the 4th chapter, before he joined the army, Liddell Hart was an anti-militarist and a failing undergraduate of history. Upon war, he pivoted to militarism. However, he remained socially isolated and psychologically fragile. His operational experiences were short and inglorious, to which he attached fictional commands and injuries. He spent the rest of his service in minor training roles. From war hero, he morphed into historian. The 5th chapter traces his evolution as a historian of the Great War. At first a sycophant, eventually a critic. His targets were Douglas Haig, the final commander of the British Expeditionary Force in which he had served, and professional soldiers in general, and official historians. His own histories went to 4 editions, almost to the eve of the Second World War. Afterwards, he influenced a narrow but popular caricature of the First World War. Even before forming his views on the Great War, Liddell Hart sought to become an academic historian. But, as the 6th chapter shows, his academic training was incomplete. He harvested private information, but was otherwise inattentive to sourcing and methodology. Like the stereotypical applicatory historian, without realizing the stereotype himself, he memorialized some commanders and strategies and demonized others, to the neglect of logistics, acquisitions, economics, technologies, and tactics. In Chapter 7, I explain how he leveraged his wartime training into peacetime doctrine, and thence co-authorship of the Infantry Training Manual. Disappointed with official rejection, he both denigrated all official manuals and misrepresented himself as sole author. Chapter 8 analyzes his self-appointed role as strategist. His strategies are often insightful. He certainly focused attention on the highest level of strategy. However, his high-mindedness about the semantics and approaches belies confused definitions, conflated levels of analysis, and unstable agendas, such as his keenness for quick, decisive wars at one time, or long, indecisive wars at another. His strategies were further corrupted by over-reliance on analogies, not as means for communication, as he excused them, but as premises for theories. He preferred abstractions over study of technologies and techniques. His abstractions could be insightful, such as indirect approach, but also naive and agenda-driven, such as his offering of unilateral good manners and disarmament as stable and ethical alternatives, mutual nuclear deterrence. Disappointed with his military career, he shifted to journalism, the subject of Chapter 9, first as a freelance sports reporter, soon as a temporary military correspondent for the Morning Post. From there, he earned a position at the Daily Telegraph, an incongruously prestigious and indulgent position for such a young and inexperienced correspondent, but one enabled by the War Department itself, which mistakenly forecast that he would improve the Army's public image. Instead, he lobbied for policies of personal appeal, such as isolationism, and against targets of personal prejudice, such as senior officers. His ageism and progressivism were fashionable. He jumped ship to the Times, the newspaper closest to government, and thence enjoyed his most direct and consistent influence on government. Chapter 10 reveals his posturing as both an army insider and an outside critic. He presented himself as both a commander by practical experience and a commander by historical study, both the general's pet and an anti-professional, both a recovering convalescent and an involuntary invalid, both propagandist and leaker, both a forced retiree and a great captain. With influence through mass media, private correspondence, and official advice, he developed himself as a political sage, as told in Chapter 11. He and his disciples portrayed him as liberal. Indeed, he favoured David Lloyd George, the erstwhile Prime Minister. Liddell Hart rejected Lloyd George's rivals for the Liberal caucus, most notably John Simon, but enjoyed his greatest policy influence on the other surviving Liberal in the last peacetime cabinet, Leslie Hall Belisha. His influence was regrettable by 1938, following a purge of the General Staff and recriminations from even beneficiaries. In the same year, Liddell Hart joined a multi-partisan discussion group called Focus, founded by Winston Churchill, a defected Liberal. He briefly his own movement for freedom. Yet his liberalism was always fuzzy and tended to break down when policies were detailed or administrations changed. His liberalism during the Second World War was policy-driven. For instance, he was against conscription, but prioritized peace at the expense of liberalism. He had always compared democracy to mob rule. He admired Italian fascism. He agreed with the policies, although not the paramilitarism, of British fascism. He portrayed Nazis as victims. He ended his political life where it had begun and always belonged, with progressive socialism. His historicizing, strategizing, journalism, propagandizing, critiquing, and politicking mesmerized some military and political principles. From 1935 to 1939, he was effectively a paid special advisor to 3 successive war secretaries. In the same period, his books and private papers influenced prime ministers. Chapter 12 reveals his influence on Britain's appeasement of Germany's reoccupation of the Rhineland, Italy's invasion of Abyssinia, Germany's and Italy's and the Soviet Union's intervention in Spain, and Germany's claims to Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. Liddell Hart suffered at least 2 breakdowns in the months before the Second World War. He was jobless when it began. Yet he sought to return to official influence. As Chapter 13 tells, he targeted Lloyd George, Belisha, Churchill, Lord Beaverbrook, James Grigg, that is Churchill's final wartime war secretary, and the soldiers he had promoted in 1937. He was never officially employed during that war, although he received privileged information, and later would suggest he was regularly employed on secret work. Chapter 14 reveals his efforts to persuade Britain to make peace. In spring 1939, he had argued preemptively for quitting. He argued for quitting when war broke out in the autumn. He argued for negotiations. He pondered emigration. He opposed Western plans to intervene in Scandinavia, and thence blamed the West for provoking Germany's intervention in Scandinavia. He promised that Germany would not invade Western Europe, and thence blamed the West for provoking Germany there too. He urged Britain to quit unilaterally or lose the war. With some merit, he warned that alliances would lead to dependency. He pondered emigration again in 1941. He argued for unilateral negotiated peace even after Germany and its allies had invaded the Soviet Union. In 1942, he invented a missed opportunity to agree peace with German agents in Sweden. He opposed the policy of unconditional surrender in 1943 with some merit, but also self-interest. He invented a missed opportunity to agree peace with German agents in Stalingrad in 1943. Despite Allied advances everywhere from 1943, he still urged negotiations for peace without regime change or accountability. He remained an apologist for Nazism and a critic of the West for provoking war and refusing peace. Liddell Hart expected the Second World War to be long and indecisive, in hope that it would be less costly than the First, as Chapter 15 explains. In the 1920s, he had realized that mechanization enables quicker invasions. In the 1930s, he decided that machines are better at carrying defenders than invaders. He proscribed offensives as the quickest way to bleed Britain's economic advantages, but allowed for raids by light tanks and heavy bombers. By the Second World War, he no longer believed that aerial bombing is the exception to defense dominance, or that it is ethical. He wanted a largely economic war, executed by blockade and sanctions, from which Britain would emerge best, given its maritime trade and economic depth. He hoped that a largely non-kinetic economic warfare would add to the moral pressure on the aggressors. He expected defensive stalemate. Thence, he expected political revolution in the homelands of the aggressors. Most of his expectations and prescriptions were discredited by events. His reinvention did not go as planned, although it succeeded eventually, as explained in Chapter 16. By 1944, he was still reframing his military views, but also intent on a new career as a philosopher of femininity. He sought to revive his journalism. He applied for academic jobs. His failures added to his Anglophobia. Finally, and most consequentially, he falsified the pre-war record to portray himself as influenceless in Britain, influential in Germany, and thus the inventor of Blitzkrieg. His reinvention gathered steam in America, where he had remotely cultivated correspondence since the early 1920s. Chapter 17 tells how he leveraged his interviews with German prisoners of war to persuade Americans that his pre-war confidence in defense dominance was actually confidence in mechanized offensives. He undertook a speaking tour of American military institutions with the help of his longtime pen pal, Robert Ickes. Ickes introduced him to Theodore Roth, who in turn introduced him, more consequentially, to J. Luvass, who was first to hagiograph him. He tried to persuade Douglas MacArthur that the general strategy during the Korean War was inspired by his pre-war writings. Still dissatisfied at home and abroad, he once again considered emigration. From America, Liddell Hart found his next most receptive nationality in Israel, the subject of Chapter 18. He pretended that he had influenced the Zionists who visited from Palestine in the 1930s. He was delighted to allude to his influence on Israel's war for independence in 1948. He fished for credit for Israel's victory in the War of 1956. He toured Israel in 1960. He sought evidence for his influence on Israel's victory in the Six-Day War of 1967. Even after his death, disciples imagined his influence on the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Amidst this belated kudos, Liddell Hart again sought an academic career. Chapter 19 starts in the 1950s, when Michael Howard's insecure request for advice on building a one-man program in military history contributed to the success of what would become the War Studies program at King's College London, and eventually most of Britain's military schools. Liddell Hart again applied for the Chichele Professorship of Military History at Oxford, but settled for honorary degrees and a visiting professorship in California, only to drop out within months. Chapter 20 explains how Liddell Hart's final publications cemented his reinvention. He was abandoned by his pre-war publishers, but was lucky to be approached by younger publishers. While Liddell Hart strung Hamish Hamilton along, he committed most of his post-war books to Cassell. In 1965, he released his memoirs, which claim responsibility for everything creditable, but irresponsibility for everything debitable. Simultaneously, he and Howard edited a Festschrift, most of whose contributors were mentees, who retold what Liddell Hart had told them. He was invited to contribute to the new Cambridge Modern History, 4 decades after he had failed to influence the old. He finished his History of the Second World War decades after he had contracted for it with Cassell, without the normal editorial oversight or fact-checking. He died just before publication in 1970. Subsequently, as revealed in Chapter 21, his son, mentees, and their students competed to memorialize or biograph him. But their self-selection and selection biases, and their concessions to his widow, inevitably corrupted the process and the products. Although none of their products satisfied any of them, they rationalized a consensus that has viciously suppressed revisionism. Now, more than a century after Basil Liddell Hart started publishing, the reader needs a comprehensive and honest guide to his life, thought, and legacy, including his insights and errors, truths and lies, achievements and omissions, virtues and vices, so that we can advance the good without the bad.